what people don't understand outside is that they see October 7th and they start saying things like, well, this is about Gaza and territory, and it really isn't. It's about the war that Israel has been fighting for the past 20 years or more with Iran and its proxies, and Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen and various Iranian proxies in Iraq, and the Assad regime in Syria, a part of this what's called resistance axis, led by Iran, funded by Iran, armed by Iran, with an explicit genocidal objective.
Hello, welcome to the Telos-Paul Institute podcast. I'm Gabriel Noah Brahm, director of the Institute's Israel Initiative. With me here today is Paul Gross, senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. His views that he will share today are his alone. The speakers on this program are solely responsible for what is said. Paul is also a noted member of the, I think it's correct to say, but correct me if I'm wrong, the Israeli center-left, notable figure in Israeli civil society, in public life, participant in some of the events that we'll be talking about today, including the protests against judicial reform in Israel, which we'll get to soon enough. He's a well-regarded author of op-eds and analysis in pieces of analysis, works of expert commentary on Middle East affairs in such fine journals as the Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, Fathom, Times of Israel, the American Interest, Persuasion. I may be leaving some out. Tell me if I have. He was a host of a very popular podcast several years ago as well. Two Jews, Three Opinions, I think, with Abe Silverstein, something like that. Paul, would you introduce yourself a little more for our audience? What more should we know about you before we dig into the issues?
Thanks very much, Gabby, and I appreciate the invitation and the introduction. Yeah, I'll add that I was born in the UK in London, graduated with a master's in Middle East politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and then moved to Israel at the age of 29 some years ago, having previously worked at the Israeli embassy in London as a speechwriter for the ambassador. And I, since moving here, what's now 17 years ago or so, I've been mainly involved in, as you say, writing about Israeli politics, Middle East politics, Jewish issues, and also wider questions of democracy and other questions that are relevant both to Israel and the wider democratic world. Yeah, you're speaking to me and you're doing this series at a very really traumatic time, I think, for Israel and Israelis. Historic time, but a traumatic time. And there's a lot, I think, to unpack and a lot for people outside Israel to understand better about what's going on here.
Indeed, and that's why we're delighted to have you in order to discuss Israel's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year. I assume there'll be retrospectives in October, regarding what's happened since October 7, 2023. But at Telos, we thought we'd get started a little early because it seemed to us, it seemed to me and my colleagues that there was some story to be told about how it is that Israel went from massive protests against the government, basically, last summer, to the events of October, which everyone is familiar with, and its aftermath. And we'd like to trace those connections and connect those dots from an Israeli perspective. In this series, we're interviewing primarily, if not exclusively, Israeli intellectuals, authors, public intellectuals, journalists, and scholars. And So we hope to provide that to the Telos audience, of you from here with sandals, if not boots, on the ground. And so let's jump right in. Paul, I sketched the framework that we mean to work within. And so first, maybe tell our audience what were the judicial reforms? Why were they so upsetting to some people? The judicial reforms that were proposed. What were they? Why were they so upsetting? How did they lead to mass protests?
Okay.
What connection, if any, what was there between that and then October 7th? What do you think, and how can you enlighten us?
So in a way, it's a strange topic to be thinking about, because things have changed so much since then. And there was a period of 10 months after the judicial reforms were announced in December 2022 until October 7th, when they were the issue on everyone's mind and on everyone's lips here in Israel, whichever side of the debate you were on. And then in the course of 24 hours, they just became somewhat irrelevant, at least in the immediate term. But you're right to raise them, because of course they speak to the unprecedented division in Israel in that 10-month period, maybe matched by a couple of other periods in Israeli history, in which every Saturday night hundreds of thousands of people would come out onto the streets to demonstrate against their own government, a protest of which I was part. I'll sketch very briefly the judicial reform. I don't want to go into too much detail unless it's necessary, or we can get into it later. But essentially, there were a series of proposals by the Justice Minister Yariv Levin, who's a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, which would, in different ways, vastly decrease the power of Israel's Supreme Court, as well as the ability of other legal professionals to have a say or influence or affect political decisions. So why was this particularly important in the Israeli context? Because Israel, unlike the United States and many other countries, doesn't have a written constitution, and has very few checks and balances on the power of the prime minister and his or her government coalition to work their will. And really the only substantial check was the Supreme Court and other legal figures, for example, legal advisors in government ministries and other things. And what these reforms would have done would have de facto prevented the Supreme Court from having that sort of influence, and also at various levels of the sort of governmental establishment, where you had professionals who were neutral civil servants, they would be replaced by political appointees. So you would be effectively transferring a whole bunch of power from legal advisors without party of political affiliation to political figures who were loyal to the government of the day. And this was seen as very problematic and very threatening to Israel's rather delicate liberal democracy. And it was the suspicion that there was that the intent was to do this, that this wasn't going to be some sort of accidental power grab, but a real deliberate attempt to install some kind of illiberal regime here. The suspicion was there partly because the makeup of the government was such that you had the most extreme far-right figures that have been in an Israeli government without any countervailing forces, without any forces from the left or the center to balance them up. And you had a prime minister in Benjamin Netanyahu who was um, because of his own legal position. Your listeners, viewers may know that he's on trial, still currently on trial for corruption in 3 separate cases, because of his own legal position that he was prioritizing his own political survival over the needs of the country. And because there was this lack of trust in Netanyahu and this feeling that he was personalizing everything, that there wasn't any faith that the government was acting with goodwill. And so you had these huge demonstrations, again, of which I was part.
Big numbers.
So at its height, you had maybe 500,000, 600,000 people on the streets in different cities. The main demonstration was in Tel Aviv, around the Kaplan Street, for those who know Israel, but also in other cities where I live in Jerusalem and other major cities, and even small towns, there were smaller demonstrations. So at its height, you may have maybe 500,000 people, which in a population of 10 million is very significant. And I think very tellingly, you had a precipitous drop in the polls for Netanyahu's Likud party. I would say probably a very unusual, almost immediate drop in the polls after this was announced, because Netanyahu himself didn't run on these reforms. Netanyahu in the election ran on security, Iran, and the cost of living. And when the question of reforms or major constitutional changes was put to him, because it was being talked about by other parties further to his right, he would downplay it and say, well, we'll deal with that some other time. It's not a major issue for us. And then very clearly it was the major issue, because it was what was being focused on almost at the expense of everything else for 10 months. Now, to get to October 7th, it's very hard I'm not sure. I'm not one of these people that is going to draw a straight line between it and say, this could never have happened if it were not for the judicial reforms, because I think there's so many things that went wrong, which were not all to do with decisions made by Netanyahu or the government. I think when there is eventually a report into what happened, I'm sure we'll see that there's plenty of blame to go around, including among the military establishment and intelligence establishment.
And we want to get into all that. I should have said, for the listeners' benefit, Paul, something that you know quite well. I ought to have said that in Israel, there are some people, many in the demos, so to speak, who find it hard to forgive. Well, first of all, the fact that the country was so divided. That's part of the background or the context for my question. Was there a connection? Otherwise, there's no obvious connection between protests about judicial reform and being attacked by terrorists. But as you know, in Israel, we don't like to play the blame game or get into politics during a war, but we do anyway. Everybody does. And so there is this question, was the country so divided that it made itself look like a target? And more particularly, there are those who are rather distraught or even bitter at the thought that the threatened refusal of pilots in the IDF, of a sector of IDF soldiers to show up for ostensibly reserve duty, but it's really very routine and important part of the Israeli military, that this must have potentially looked made us look more vulnerable. And indeed, I believe we were a little extra unprepared, because some of the pilots were out of training, that their skills were not where they should be. All of this is in dispute, however, which is why I'm not here to lecture on it, but to pose the question. How do you see that issue?
Well, I mean, I think it's unarguable that if you're an enemy of Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, then Israel looks in not great shape for the 10 months preceding October 7th. And Israel looks, and if you are planning an attack, then it could certainly be a time when Israel looks vulnerable. The question then is, who's to blame for this? Now, those who support Netanyahu in the government would say that it's the fault of those, for example, as you said, who refused to, those special forces and Air Force pilots who refused to go to reserve duty. I would say that it's the fault of the government for pushing this extraordinarily radical change onto the country without much consultation, without any willingness to dilute it. I mean, the question of whether the Supreme Court is too powerful is that question. Many people would answer yes to that. But many of the people who answered yes to that would nevertheless say that the reforms that the government were putting forward were far too extreme, that they would tilt the balance, the pendulum would swing from being too much in favor of the judiciary all the way over to the executive branch in American terminology.
There are those who say it's the most powerful judiciary in the world.
There's a lot of that. Might well be true. That might well be true. I would say that unfortunately there might be a need for that in the Israeli context because there are no other checks and balances. So I think that what needs to happen is there needs to be a simultaneous weakening of the judiciary and establishing other anchors, other checks and balances in the system to compensate for that. And the government was not doing that. In fact, there were all kinds of ways in which its measures could have been diluted to do that, but the government refused to do that, which I think is telling. Anyway. Look, a few data points here. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant from the Likud gave a speech sometime, I think maybe May or June last year, in which he basically said that although he personally supports the judicial reform, he thinks it would be a good idea to pause them or in some way dilute them. Because the weakening of the civil society and the morale, the effect it's having on the morale of the armed forces is a security threat to Israel.
Well, he was right. He was right. The military was having a hard time keeping itself together, was what we were hearing.
Right. And Netanyahu's response was to fire him, which he then had to backtrack on because there was instantaneous protests from people who had never voted for Yoav Gallant, by the way. But people who felt that this was an extraordinary reaction by a prime minister to the warning by the defense minister that Israeli security was being harmed by these proposals. And then we now know, and we only know this post October 7th, there were 3 separate messages sent by the IDF leadership to Netanyahu warning him that the judicial reform and what was going and the protests it was creating was bad for morale and was bad for Israeli security. That essentially you had a number of Israeli soldiers who were just saying, if the country changes its character and is no longer and moves to this sort of illiberal regime, we're not willing to risk our lives for it anymore. And that was I think something that was absolutely critical, and that Netanyahu, I think, did seem to ignore. And so in that sense, you can say as I said, I don't think there's a straight line because there's so many things that led to October 7th. Can we say if there were no judicial reform and even if there was a different prime minister, would October 7th never have happened? I don't think we can say that. I don't think we can say that. I don't believe in making these kind of categorical statements. Would it have been better to have not had the judicial reform in terms of Israel's security preparation? Yes. Would it have been better, in my view, to have had a prime minister who was not sort of spending a lot of his time thinking about his own personal situation and his own need to stay in power in the months preceding October 7th? Yes. But yeah, these are counterfactuals which by definition could not be proven. And I think that we need to deal with the here and now. And my major criticism of Netanyahu now is more about is less about whether or not he was to blame for October 7th and more about the way the government has operated since October 7th.
I want to ask you about where we are here and now in a moment. Most specifically, I wonder if you can enlighten us as to how it is perhaps that the world outside of Israel may not know or quite what's going on here, how it looks here in Israel. I want to ask you if you could, again, we're here inviting your informed opinion, your speculations informed by experience and study. I wonder if we can get to it shortly, what you think it is people outside of Israel might not know about Israel or not understand. I understand that you are giving a lecture on this topic. In fact, you've given an invited talk in Britain on this, so I know you've given it some thought. Before we get to that, if we could just back up a little and dig into the reforms question, the question of responsibility a little more. I have a few questions for you. I should say in passing that an American audience, for example, will have no idea what you're talking about when you speak of a corrupt head of state who's more interested in staying in power than he is in the good of the country. I mean, this will make no sense to Americans. This is really just an Israeli problem. Other countries at large don't have such problems, but certainly not the U.S. At the moment. So thanks for mentioning it. As to the changes that were viewed as so radical that I believe it bears mentioning, courageous, highly skilled pilots, soldiers, dedicated soldiers who've served for years and decades and who basically are, in some ways, the backbone of the country. It's, we're all a part of the country, but these folks are respected by and large. And their response after October 7, I think it bears mentioning, was to show up in so many numbers that the more people showed up than were called up. So that needs, I think, to be mentioned. At the same time, you use the term sort of like civil servants, permanent bureaucracy, one might say, where a lot of them had roles in of that sort. Some might have been working in high tech. I don't know if the world understands, but we have people working in, well-paying high-tech jobs who then, put on the uniform and go fight wars. And when they do that, they the economy suffers, their companies suffer. So permanent civil servants that might be considered more or less neutral, I think you said a moment ago, CEOs, executives in companies, maybe in particular the high-tech sector. Is this what some people refer to, this sort of, elite class with maybe some sort of outsized influence? Is it what people call the deep state or the deep shtetl? And I wonder what you yourself might think about the critique of the professional managerial class. Telos has a long history of digging into the problem of the new class or the professional managerial class, or societies that are ostensibly democracies, but in fact, in many ways are governed by permanent bureaucrats. And so there are those who think that's a problem and others who think it's all to the good. In the case of America, Israel is not Switzerland, Israel is not America. Nevertheless, it's been having this debate of its own, as you know, and that's partly what the judicial reform was about. Can you characterize a little further than those folks who were hesitating to show up because they thought the reforms were altering the character of the country? They wanted to serve a Jewish and democratic state, and they thought that the latter the latter value of democracy was falling out. Do you buy into at all the characterization of that successful, talented sector as itself representing, in some cases, in some countries, a bit of a problem in its own right, or is it all to the good here? We're in a kind of constant war zone with the threat of war. Maybe we need, unlike other countries, such a caste to govern over us. Maybe it's the demos itself that can't afford democracy, but ought to have a kind of technocratic elite dictating to them. Maybe it's necessary. I don't know. I ask you.
Well, there's a lot there. I think, Gabby, I think it's very convenient for Netanyahu primarily, who, by the way, as a Ashkenazi multimillionaire educated at MIT, is about as elite as you can get. I think it's very convenient for Netanyahu to paint the picture that you've very well described. My view is that attempts to claim that Israel is in some way dealing with the issues, dealing with these issues, the deep state issue, the managerial elite issue, in the same way that the United States is and some other countries is. I just think it's a false claim. I just don't think it fits the Israeli model at all. And I think, and I'll give you an example of that. The people who were demonstrating on the streets, who, as you rightly say, were in many cases, certainly in Tel Aviv, were drawn from sort of, let's put it this way, educated middle class people working in high tech, working in, doing well for themselves, let's say.
Academics.
These people,
academics too.
Academics indeed. These people were. It's funny, these people were, I think, in other countries where sort of populism has reared its head, these people have not got involved. And what I think was extraordinary about Israel, and what I think for people like me, with my views and my values, was so encouraging, was that these people who were always sort of sneeringly referred to as like the sort of, these kind of Tel Avivim who, as long as they can sip their cappuccino in a nice cafe in Tel Aviv after a day in the office and head off to a nightclub in the evening, don't really care about what's happening in the country.
Well, you said it, not me.
When they felt that their democracy was under threat, and that the only thing that would stop a government from harming minority rights, harming equality in the country, from changing the electoral system, from doing all kinds of things that they would be able to do without the check of the Supreme Court, they came onto the streets. And they came onto the streets, not, by the way, like a lot of left-wing protests in other countries, where the protest movement is radical, is not just criticizing the government, but is criticizing the country, is burning the flag of the country or whatever. On the contrary, these protesters wrapped themselves in the Israeli flag. Every protest ended with the singing of Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem. These were patriotic Israelis who felt that their country was being taken away from them. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think that people who supported the reform are any less patriotic. But this was about, I think, to some extent, the direction the country takes. But also, I also believe quite strongly that a lot of people who initially supported the judicial reform became much less keen on it the more they learned about it. And certainly in Jerusalem, which is a more conservative and more religious city than Tel Aviv, where I would go to demonstrations, I would see people with kippot, with skull caps, religious people at the demonstrations. I also know of people that were Likud voters at the demonstrations.
Likud is the sort of Republican Party of Israel, the right,
yeah, the
right-wing,
traditional center-right,
okay.
The traditional center-right party of Israel, which I think in recent years has become less center-right and more right. But that's I think that's largely and that, by the way, that's Netanyahu's doing, not because he believes it. Netanyahu himself, until a few years ago, was one of the big supporters and defenders of Supreme Court independence. And to go back to my earlier point about the lack of trust in him, it's hard to escape the the kind of idea that he changed not because he was convinced otherwise, but because he was in legal trouble, and that it was in his interests to have a weak Supreme Court and to effectively delegate power to more extreme figures in his coalition, who genuinely did believe in getting rid of Supreme Court power for different reasons, by the way. There were different factions in the coalition that needed it for different reasons. The ultra-Orthodox for different reasons, the settlement movement for different reasons. So I think that I just think that it's just not the same. And I'm familiar with the debate in the United States. I actually, despite not being a fan of the current iteration of the American right, I'm very sympathetic to a lot of their critique of what's happening in the United States at universities and in the culture wars and the sort of progressive, quote unquote, I don't think there's anything progressive about it, but the so-called progressive movement in the United States. I just don't think that is applicable to large parts of Israel at all.
Okay, well, this is another preview of things to come in the time remaining. We do want to talk about the American campus, where wokeism and so-called progressivism, cancel culture, has had effects that you've been critical of, as you mentioned, and of late, very definite effects with regards to expressions of hatred for Israel. So we'll get to that. And yet, I still want to know a few more things briefly about the protests that were protesting, as you argue, unacceptable proposed changes that would shift the balance of power in the way you've described. Can we pick one? Because it's very complicated. If you'll permit me, I'll pick out one thing that it seems to me is sort of clear enough on its own in a way, and it's kind of a philosophical question. One of the changes was to take away the power of the court to overthrow, forgive me for laughing, because in American context, this would be funny indeed. We have a constitution, and courts don't overturn constitutional laws because they deem them unreasonable. Now, again, I have to laugh because Zionism, whatever it was never, I think, considered reasonable. First and foremost, it was a dream, and it was, it was successful, and of course, it was in many ways reasonable and necessary for the Jews to pursue their independence in their homeland. But it also included a lot of imagination and risk taking. And I guess I'm sort of implying a little Jewish joke along the way, if the listeners don't mind. The Jewish country can't be held to the standard of reasonableness. But the serious point is, do you believe that that's a proper standard for any branch of government? A law is passed, it's constitutional, it's legal, it's not reasonable.
Okay, so firstly, let's clarify what we're talking about. So we're talking about the ability of the court to overturn legislation on the grounds that it is, and the actual terminology is extreme unreasonableness. Okay, so actually the bar is a little higher than you're claiming, and this is not something, by the way, that is used particularly frequently. It's also not something that came out of what was called the judicial revolution, when the Supreme Court became much more powerful in the early 90s as a result of some constitutional changes that were passed by the Knesset. It actually, this dates back to the founding of the state. This is taken from British law. So this wasn't some new thing. Now, what are we talking about when we say extreme reasonable? Effectively, the way it's usually been applied is in things like government appointments. So, for example, a government minister appoints as the head of his ministry, rather than appointing someone who's suitable for the task, he appoints his brother. Or some such thing. Now, there's nothing illegal about what he's done, and because there are very few you don't have, as you would have in the United States, the separation of powers between the president and the executive branch and the legislative branch, right? So here, the executive sits in the legislature, in the parliamentary system, and has a majority by definition in the legislature. So unless there's some rebellion in the coalition, which happens far less in Israel than it does in, say, a country like Britain for a number of reasons, which I could go into. Effectively, the government, the executive branch, can pass whatever it wants and can do whatever it wants. And unless something is actually illegal, then it can obviously do what it wants. Now, the court can say this is by any measure, it's extremely unreasonable that you would appoint to an important state position, receiving a government salary, dealing with the welfare of millions of Israelis, your brother, who's entirely unqualified for this. And I think
imagine it like if in America,
that's
the
extremely
president appointed
unreasonable.
his nephew, for example.
Once the government does away with that ability of the court to do that, there's nothing, literally nothing, to stop a minister doing that. Now, there was a proposal made by, again, this goes back to my point about how the intent of the government to institute a kind of power grab seemed to be clear by how radical the proposals were. There were other suggestions made to change the reasonableness law to make it harder to implement in certain ways, and dilutions of it. And these were rejected in favor of a blanket wipeout of the thing. And in every case, I mean, by the way, in choosing the reasonableness one, you actually chose the least impactful one. There were others like the override clause, like the appointment, like changes to the appointments of judges, which would have been far more impactful. But this reasonableness one is just an example of how there was a way to fix it, to make it more difficult for the Supreme Court to use it, but they went right to the extreme remedy of just getting rid of it. It all adds up. It all adds up to what seems like an attempt by the government to establish an illiberal regime, by which I mean a sort of Hungary, or to a greater extent Turkey situation, where a previously liberal democratic country incrementally reduces the ability of institutions to check the power of the majority.
I see what you mean. And that got a lot of very noble people out in the streets. I went as an observer to these protests. I didn't go to participate in them. I couldn't help admiring the people all around me. People were very upbeat, hugging, singing. I was in these crowds, so I, was exchanging gestures of goodwill with my fellow citizens. They just seemed like marvelous people on the whole. I heard the speeches. They were inspiring, although, to make my point, I have to say that they weren't speaking from my point of view. You yourself were drawn into public life at a level that you hadn't been before, I think. Can you tell us what it was like from the inside of the, was it called the resistance? What was it called?
The protest movement. I mean, I was involved in a number of ways. One thing I was doing was I was part of a small group of people that were organizing olim, that is immigrants to Israel, especially from English-speaking countries, who were against the judicial reforms. It was a group called Olim for Democracy, and we organized not just information about the protest, but we also did. I personally organized and hosted a bunch of webinars in English, interviewing various people to sort of expand the information that was out there in English about the protests. I honestly think if someone had said to me 2 years ago, what's been the most meaningful Israeli or Zionist moment or Israeli patriotic moment of your time in Israel, I think I probably would have said something a little bit soppy, like hearing my child speak Hebrew for the first time. Raising native Hebrew-speaking children in Israel, which is still something that I find very, very, very meaningful to me. after October 7th, sorry, not October 7th, after judicial reforms and being part of the protest movement, I would honestly say that seeing hundreds of thousands of people waving Israeli flags, holding up copies of Israel's Declaration of Independence, and singing Hatikva because they feared, genuinely feared, their country being taken away from them, was the most powerful experience of my Israeli life. And that by the way, I'll just add one other thing. As part of some of the work I was doing and writing I was doing about democracy and these kinds of issues, more broadly, I interviewed a couple of law professors from Hungary and Poland, who were against the regimes in their country, the Orban regime in Hungary and the now previous Polish regime, the Law and Justice Party in Poland. They said they came to Israel and observed the protests. And one of them, I don't remember which one, said he was in tears because he was so admiring of what the Israelis were doing and was so distraught that this hadn't happened in his country. This hadn't happened in their countries, people did not see the danger until it was too late. And he said to me, these Israelis, it wasn't just about, particular topics, something as amorphous as democracy managed to bring out hundreds of thousands of Israelis. And I really think that speaks to a sense of solidarity and patriotism in Israel, which doesn't exist in a lot of other places. By the way, after October 7th, the unity and solidarity was extraordinary. One of the criticisms of this government was that on October 8th, the government was nowhere. These people were suffering, survivors from the massacres, and the government was nowhere, not physically, not in statements from the prime minister, and the people that sprang into action were civil society, and in particular, by the way, the organizations that had been running the protest movement used the money they'd raised and the infrastructure they'd built to pivot towards this issue and organize massive relief efforts for people who had been who were fleeing, who basically internal refugees because they were fleeing the south, effectively, survivors of the massacre. And I think, and there's been a huge amount of, I would say, national unity, but with growing political division in Israel since October 7th.
Okay, in the aftermath, we want to move along and move forward to October 7th, in the aftermath, having covered the judicial reforms. I think in sufficient detail for our purposes. I will just second your comment about the solidarity on October 8th, even on the day of October 7th, when former soldiers simply grabbed their pistols and drove their cars to the south and saved people and did what they could. Israelis are a special bunch in this respect, and there was enormous solidarity. The slogan in those days was B'yachad Ninatzeach. There were banners all around, together we win. And this was a country that was so divided the day before. For a good few months, I think that slogan held, but I don't see those signs anymore. And I see signs of fissure more and more. So tell us eventually how we got from that point to where we are now, but let's hover over the day itself. What was it like where you were? And is there more you can say about Israel's response to it than you have already, without getting into the weeds about things we won't know until the investigation is done, to see how, this great military, with all its high-tech resources, could have failed in this regard? I guess I'll mention just in passing, it was Herzi Halevi's military, Herzi Halevi, being appointed by Yoav Gallant shortly before the elections that brought Netanyahu back to power.
By Benny Gantz, not Yoav Gallant.
I meant Benny Gantz, thank you. Yeah. I get them confused for some reason. Galantzenkot. Sometimes I mix up these three. I don't know why, but that's sort of inside baseball. But it is relevant in a way, because it is argued that the head of the IDF was supposed to have some independence from that was designed that way, even implemented tactically by the center-left faction that was concerned about Bibi's grip on power. And well, Haaretz is pretty much disgraced at this point for having failed in all kinds of ways that we can't really go into here. But the whole concept of a small military, a high-tech military, the conception, the concept, maybe if you want to say that Hamas and Hezbollah were more or less held at bay. We can sort of just sit on top of this, mow the lawn. They want to govern. They're not interested in really fighting us. That kind of responsibility, but correct me if I'm wrong, is spread around in Israel. I know people who solely pin it on Netanyahu, intelligent people who say to me, Gabi, the buck stops somewhere. I know enough to believe, but that's not quite so. But you're more of an expert than me. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I mean, look, the buck does stop somewhere, and it does stop with the prime minister. And in Israeli, and historically, that has been the case. Golda Meir resigned after the Yom Kippur War. Menachem Begin was basically pushed to resign. I mean, pushed himself to resign as a consequence, partly as a consequence of the fallout from the First Lebanon War. And I think the assumption after October 7th, because we are talking, let's be clear, we are talking about the single worst day in the history of the state of Israel and the greatest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, the largest in terms of numbers terrorist attack since 9/11 anywhere in the world. So, I mean, looking at it like that, just the numbers and the enormity of it, you can say a prime minister can't survive this happening on his watch.
But can he be sort of almost solely or mainly responsible? George Bush didn't get tagged as being responsible for 9/11.
Right. Okay. So I think, again, historically, Israelis expect a prime minister to take responsibility for these things because other prime ministers have done that. And Netanyahu's refusal to take responsibility in any way when other people have done. Haaretz Halevi, who you mentioned, and I quite agree with you that he bears responsibility and others do. I would not, despite the fact that the buck stops with Netanyahu, clearly, if heads are going to roll, it's not just his head, it's plenty of other heads who are not both in the political arena and in the military and the intelligence community. But his head should also be one that is at least discussed, and the fact that Halevi and Gallant, the defense minister, and other ministers and other people have taken some responsibility and have said that we need to look at mistakes that I personally have made, and the one figure who has not is the prime minister. And that, in addition to other things, the guy hasn't given he gave his first interview on Israeli media 2 weeks ago, since October 7th. Having spoken to the American media plenty of times, his first interview in Hebrew to Israeli media 2 weeks ago, and who was it to? Channel 14, which is the sort of pro-Bibi media channel. It's like Trump giving an interview to Newsmax or Biden giving an interview to MSNBC, right? It's that sort of thing. And so that the sense that he is cutting himself off from responsibility and from difficult questions, from not willing to face difficult questions. This, I think, is part of the problem of this responsibility question. But yeah, you are right that it's not just Bibi. I would reject, despite my own very negative perception of Netanyahu by this point, I would reject those who say that it's only on Bibi, that ultimately other people should aren't to blame, that you shouldn't be looking anywhere other than the prime minister's office. I don't think that's true at all. But yes, also Netanyahu.
Very good. Very thought-provoking, nuanced response from you, Paul. I can say asking these questions around these days, and as part of this series, I don't always get the most nuanced answers. And I thank you for your.
We're not at a nuanced moment, unfortunately.
Right. So all the more valuable your balanced mind. What then about Israel would you say? What are some of the things that people outside of this tiny Jewish state might not understand, might not know in places like Britain, where you'll be speaking on this subject soon, if I'm remembering correctly, the United States, but really in principle, anywhere. You've traveled between Israel and your country of birth enough. You keep tabs on British politics. You're very knowledgeable about American politics as well. What do Americans or Brits get wrong, to be blunt?
Yeah, so when I think about this, I'm not thinking about what the people who are protesting against Israel, the anti-Israel brigade, the from the river to the sea mob. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about people that are broadly pro-Israel or certainly see themselves as generally favorable towards Israel, but I think are missing some really important things. So one is that they see a lot of people outside Israel see everything in Israel through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? So, for example, the judicial reforms, I would read reports about the judicial reforms in the New York Times or in the British press, and they would talk about the end the occupation banners that were up at the protests. Now, it's true there were those, but they were a tiny minority of people holding them, and they were very deliberately put in their own separate part of the protest, because for the protest movement more broadly was saying that's not the main issue. Some people might want to connect it, and you can find certain ways in which it is connected, but that wasn't the main issue. People could have all kinds of views about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and still be against the judicial reform. And this was, I think, not understood by a lot of people.
And it's so true. So, I just have to echo that. It's so, you feel it here, you know it. It's just not the issue with that protest movement.
Right. And I would often, I remember I would give talks to, I frequently give talks to visiting groups from the US and the UK and other places. And they would always say to me, what about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What about a two-state solution? And I would have to tell them, I said, look, I can talk about it if you want, but honestly, this is not, I'm talking about pre-October 7th. This is not something that most Israelis are talking about. And the fact is that, you know, it hasn't been an election issue in Israel, probably since the 2009 election, I would say. Right, there's been many elections since then, as we know, because we had a slew of elections, of 5 elections in very close proximity. It's been about the cost of living. It's been about the issue of ultra-Orthodox serving in the army. It's been more recently about the personality of Netanyahu, whether you're for or against him. It's been about issues like democracy and the judicial question.
Buses on Saturday, non-kosher.
Right, yeah, right, religion and state, all these domestic issues. All these domestic issues that were kind of ignored because the fundamental issue was, where do you stand on a Palestinian state? Where do you stand on settlements in the West Bank? And that was basically done away with as a political issue because the Palestinians had revealed themselves to be an entirely unreliable peace partner, rejecting offer after offer. Supposedly moderate figures like the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, would lie and incite and speak. You know, Abbas, before October 7th, gave a speech in which he basically said that he was talking about the Holocaust. He was talking to an Arab audience, and he was talking about the Holocaust. And he basically said something along the lines of, the Jews had it coming. Like it was something along the lines of, well, you can see why the Jews were so unpopular in Germany because they owned all the banks, and he was, parroting classic
People say
anti-Semitic
that
tropes.
kind of stuff all the time. They have
Right.
Hitler
Classic,
Cafe.
right.
So
And
on. I mean,
there was a hilarious tweet by Martin Indyk, a sort of old former Israeli ambassador, American ambassador to the United States, who was part of this American Democrat-leaning peace, kind of peace, that what a friend of mine, Shani Moore, calls the peace processors, right? The people who were invested in the peace process. And he wrote this tweet in which he expressed his shock and horror that his friend Mahmoud Abbas could use such classic anti-Semitic tropes. And I felt like replying to him and saying, where have you been? Those of us who've had our eyes open and have been listening to what the Palestinian leadership has been saying, and not just reading the way the Palestinians are reported in the Western press, are not surprised by this at all. And so Israelis understand this instinctively about the Palestinian leadership. I'm not saying necessarily about every Palestinian, but the Palestinian.
And that includes Israeli left. This was this would
right.
surprise Americans.
So what happened is you had a coming together of the sort of grimly vindicated skeptics, those who were always against, who never trusted the Palestinians in the first place, and people like me who supported the peace process, who supported two states, and had to face the reality that there is no partner to deal with. There is no way at this point of doing a deal with the Palestinians in a way which doesn't massively threaten the security of me and my children. A Palestinian state in the West Bank would be less than a mile from where I live in Jerusalem. I can have all kinds of high-minded ideas about ending the occupation and wanting the Palestinians to have a state, and I do want the Palestinians to have a state. But I also have to ask myself the question: am I willing to have a Palestinian state that might look like Hamas's run Gaza?
What kind of a state? Israelis are now asking themselves, what
am I willing to have that state a mile from my house, where I'm raising my children? And the answer is no. And a lot of Israelis felt like that. And so this issue was dead as a political issue. And so what I think in terms of what people don't understand outside is that they see October 7th in the context of this, and they start saying things like, well, this is about Gaza and territory, and it really isn't. It's about the war that Israel has been fighting for the past 20 years or more with Iran and its proxies, and Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen and various Iranian proxies in Iraq, and the Assad regime in Syria, a part of this what's called resistance axis, led by Iran, funded by Iran, armed by Iran, with an explicit genocidal objective of wiping out Israel, which makes, by the way, all the accusations of genocide, that Israel's committing genocide, particularly absurd and offensive. That we are on the receiving end of a genocidal regime and its proxies, and this, I think, that the failure to understand this is why you get things like countries responding to October 7th by saying, we will recognize a Palestinian state, as though the response to October 7th is to throw a bone to the Palestinians.
A reward.
Right. And this, I think, is hugely speaks to a complete misunderstanding of what's going on here. And again, it's something that Israelis, including Israelis on the center and the left, the majority, instinctively understand. In the last election, the last Israeli election, the only Israeli party that believes in pursuing a Palestinian state as a matter of urgency, Meretz, did not get enough votes to get into the Knesset. Right? The opposition to the Likud, to Netanyahu, was mainly Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party, which is a centrist party, which basically says what I'm saying about the two-state solution, that it supports it in principle, but it's not doable right now, and we need to focus on other things.
Why isn't it, briefly? I mean, you've given it, I think, a pretty good description indeed. But when you say right now you're talking about after October 7, you're informing our audience that even before October 7, during the protest movements, when October hadn't happened, there had been enough experience of frustration with attempts to make peace that the protest movement was not only not about that. We're almost starting to run out of time, so we need to be brief. But I do want to ask you about the American campus in a moment. But I have to say, when you say not now, you mean surely after October 7, not now. Is there any constituency for two states in the foreseeable future in Israel, however much clamoring there is for it elsewhere? Is that fair to say? And just sound a bit naive. Why? Why is that? Why, Paul? Why?
Well, I think I think there's a couple of important data points here. When October 7th happened, there was concerns raised by the security establishment here that we would see, as a result of what happened October 7th, also violence against Israel from the north from Hezbollah, and also in the West Bank, from Palestinians in the West Bank. Now, we've seen it majorly in Lebanon, but not really in the West Bank. Now, what do Gaza and southern Lebanon have in common, which the West Bank does not? Israel withdrew from Gaza and southern Lebanon. It has not withdrawn from the West Bank. That's now the idea for most Israelis, the idea that the response to October 7th, the response to the largest atrocity, massacre, mass rape, mutilation and torture and kidnapping of Jews since the Holocaust, from a territory which Israel withdrew from, the idea that the response to that is to withdraw from somewhere else, strikes most Israelis as completely insane. Now, I'm going to caveat, the one caveat I'm going to give to this is this. There is this question of normalization with Saudi Arabia, which was gathering pace before October 7th, has been stalled by October 7th, but is not off the table. The Saudis still seem keen. Israel certainly wants to pursue it in some way. And there's some question about whether what it means when the Saudis say that in order to sign a deal with Israel, we need some kind of movement on the Palestinian issue. Now, there are some who say that this means Israel needs to get back into negotiations with the Palestinians. I don't think that's what it said. I don't think that's what it is. And I think there's plenty of Israelis that will tell you that's not what it is. The Saudis themselves, especially MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, who's a younger generation, don't really care about the Palestinian issue. But they understand that it's an extremely potent issue in the Arab world, including their own country. So they have to throw a bone to these people. And they can't have a situation where they sign a deal with Israel while Israel is saying, there's never going to be a Palestinian state. We're going to annex the West Bank. We're going to build wherever we want in the West Bank. We're going to let settlers, including more extreme settlers, do what they want in the West Bank. And I think it's legitimate for the Saudis to expect Israel to say, we understand that this conflict will be resolved ultimately by a two-state deal with the Palestinians. But that cannot happen until there is major reform in the Palestinian arena, not just governance, ending of corruption and kleptocracy and all the things that have plagued Palestinian society and governance since day one, but also in the way that Palestinians talk about Israel and the way that Palestinians talk about Jews. No more education system that teaches that the Jews have no connection to the land of Israel. No more Palestinian Authority-controlled media that uses anti-Semitic tropes in its depiction of Israelis. No, a Palestinian leadership that says explicitly in Arabic to its people, we will have to make concessions. There will be no full right of return of Palestinian refugees to Israel. Palestine will be the state for the Palestinians. Israel will be the state of the Jewish people. Until the Palestinians get to this point of understanding that there are two peoples in this land who both have a claim to this land, and that sharing it doesn't just mean signing some piece of paper, but actually understanding and stating that there is a legitimate Jewish claim to this patch of land, then a deal cannot be done. And I think Israel can say we support a two states, but we need to get to this point. In the meantime, we're not going to build new settlements. We're going to clamp down harder on extremists in the settlement movement that are attacking Palestinians. Yeah, I think we should absolutely do those things. But there should be no expectation that we're going to jump back into negotiations with this Palestinian leadership.
Well, there's another group I can think of who doesn't want no two states. They want 48. That was the chant on American college campuses. We don't want no two state. We want 48, wearing keffiyehs or the sort of how to describe scarves associated with the Palestinian cause, but sometimes worn not exclusively by any means, but occasionally by terrorists, and green headbands for Islamic Jihad. I think that's their gear. And well, listeners probably know what was happening on the American campus, but there too, and I put this to you now as a question, there was rejection of two states by American college students and professors whose response on October 7 and 8, before Israel had even responded, when Israel was attacked viciously, the response on American campuses that exploded and lasted and led to this tentifada where students were camped out in tents at Ivy League schools and across the country, there seemed to be quite a strong appetite for rejecting the possibility of two states in that sector of civil society, because their point clearly was that they view all of Israel as a settlement, as an occupation. And there were very clear calls right after October 7th applauding Hamas and from college students and faculty to push this further and wipe out Israel. What does that look like to you, to Israelis? But you also know a lot more about American politics than some Brits and Israelis. I wonder if you could comment on that as we start to wrap up now. We are, after all, Telos, an independent journal adjacent to academia with an interest in academia. We have a new issue of our print edition coming out, Politics in the University, that should be available to subscribers soon. And so it's a topic of interest for us at Telos. The nature of higher education and the role of critical theory is, again, something central to our work at Telos, and that's something else you know about. So again, I'm loading up these questions and giving you quite a lot on your plate to respond to, because I know you'll pick and choose what it is you want to focus on. How did the campus look, and do you think that critical theory softened the ground for not just support of Palestinians suffering and so on, but for Hamas, for the vicious terrorist organization? How do you see the campus?
I think there's a particularly toxic brew of stuff going on with campuses. So I think you have critical theory, you have post-colonial studies, sort of Edward Said's malign legacy in many ways of creating a world in which the West and white people more broadly are always the oppressor, and people of dark skin and people living in the non-Western world and people who aren't Christian, or as it turns out, or not Jewish, and certainly if they're Muslim, are always the victims of oppression, and lack any kind of agency in their actions. That everything they do is explainable or justifiable as a response to white/Western/Zionist oppression. I think that very much is part of what's going on. And then you have the identity politics situation as well, where I think it's hard to really say anything other than it's kind of rank anti-Semitism, that where Jewish people as an identity group are put to one side as part of the oppressor class, that cannot be part of any victim class, that cannot be victims, that anti-Semitism cannot be seen as a form of racism or discrimination that needs to be fought as a progressive cause, because Jews are by definition not progressive, anti-progressive, colonial oppressors because of Zionism. And this is, I think it's sort of these more contemporary themes, these more contemporary ideas are latching onto the much older Soviet pushed Zionism as racism stuff from the 1970s, which influenced a whole generation of leftists in the West. And then I think there's one added element, which I think is interesting as well, which is the Islamist element, right? Where you actually have support for Hamas and a refusal, I think, to see Islamism for what it is, which is essentially a sort of non-Western version of fascism, as a kind of and not just a version of fascism, but something that was explicitly influenced by fascism, as people like Jeffrey Herf, Matthias Kunzel have written about. You know, the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Hamas is an offshoot, was explicitly influenced by the Nazis. They translated Mein Kampf into Arabic, right? And these people are, I think it's interesting that, you know, one of the things that shocked me, and I've seen a lot of anti-Israel student protests in my time. One of the things that shocked me is the way that the old taboo against saying Jews rather than Zionists has gone from some places. So you actually hear people saying "kill the Jews." In Sydney, I think in Sydney, there was a big thing saying "kill the Jews," and people are explicitly attacking Jews as Jews. Right, synagogues.
Meanwhile, Zionist can mean Jew more than ever, too. I mean, I take your point.
Of course,
the taboo is gone,
that's true.
But no one doubts that anti-Zionism now is, by and large, if not just equivalent with anti-Semitism. When you're loudly denouncing Zionism and calling for these supporting Hamas, I mean, when you say that the term anti-Zionism now is, to many of us, equivalent in its own way to anti-Semitism. There used to be debate about how to separate the two, but maybe this is just my perception. I take your point that the taboo has fallen away. People say they don't like the Jews. That used to be really beyond the pale. But when people say they don't like Zionists, a lot of times now, isn't it pretty clear?
Yeah. It reminds me of one of Jeremy Corbyn's many faux pas, as when he was leader of the Labour Party, was he talked about he was challenged by some British Jews at a meeting, and he said that he doesn't understand the Zionist sense of humor. Now there was nothing Zionist in what they said, right? And they weren't Israelis, so he clearly meant Jewish. But yeah, it's this is where we are.
Well, and this is where we are, almost out of time, and we've kept you long, so I have to really thank you again for being generous with your time. Did you address critical theory? I want to make sure that I do my job for the critical theory audience that Telos serves. You spoke about the campus. You got us from August to October to this August. We'll wrap up maybe with just a final sort of philosophical question about the role of not exactly philosophy, but this thing called critical theory. You did mention Edward Said, I guess, so maybe you've covered it already, and I'm needlessly repeating the question.
Well, I mean, all I'll say is that I think that it's not a coincidence at all that the people who are, protesting on the streets are also the same people who lap up Ibrahim X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. And I mean, to me, it's sort of obvious, because they're imbibing. It's the same idea, if you like, that there are groups of people who are always victims and deserving of sympathy, and groups of people who are always oppressors and deserving of condemnation. And that is, and Israel and Jews are firmly in the latter camp for these people.
Well, you put it lucidly, and when you put it like that, I have to say one feels the weight of it. This isn't going away anytime soon, I think, for those of us who have something to do with academia and with intellectual life in terms of public discourse abroad. And at the same time, in Israel, people sort of get the message, even if it's befuddling to a lot of native-born Israelis. So thanks for stating the problem in that regard and for informing us about this plethora of troubles that Israelis are facing, have been facing for at least the last year. And well, maybe we'll check back in with you a year from now and see how things stand. As you know, as well as any Israeli, at the moment, we worry about the north, a possible war with Hezbollah. Hopefully, we'll be here to check in with one another a year from now. That's a little dark humor.
Yeah, well, if I can just end on one positive note, for all my criticisms of the government and the criticisms of the military leadership, our soldiers are doing an extraordinary job, risking their lives and getting to grips with an unprecedented situation in Gaza, which, as people like John Spencer and others have written, has never been dealt with before by any army, with the hundreds of miles of tunnels and booby traps and terrorists in civilian clothes, and they're doing an extraordinary job. And we in Israel are indebted to our heroic soldiers. And if there's one thing that gives me strength and hope, it's that this country is full of extraordinary people. Maybe not all of them in the government right now, but in my view, but they are here, and they can make a difference, and they can keep this country flourishing and prospering.
And that's how we know that indeed we'll be back in a year if you'll be kind enough to join us, and we'll see what's been happening. The valorous, courageous, brave, and dedicated, and long-serving now soldiers that you refer to are, I think, universally admired. I think we can safely say it's something we can all agree on in a country with a lot of disagreements. The young men and women doing the fighting in Gaza and in the north as well. Lo noflim midor teshach, if I get it right, is their slogan. Don't fall below am I translating it correctly? Don't fall beneath the level of the 1948 founding generation. Right. The courage that they had and the strength that they had. Is that I understand a widespread slogan among the really very committed young soldiers whom you refer to. It gives something of the flavor, I think, correctly, of maybe the most hopeful thing we have. I think when I hear that slogan being stated and echoed, I have to say that's the one that I hold to my heart. Did I translate it reasonably?
Yeah, good translation.
Cool. Well, lo noflim midor teshach as well to you, Paul. We count on you and your valor. Thanks very much for being here and for a beautiful presentation of your takes on all these things. A bit different from another podcast guest that we have already posted, Gadi Taub. Up soon is Jonathan Spire, Gabriele Segre, an Italian-Israeli public intellectual, Orion Morris, someone, again, a literary critic in Israel and a Hebrew language novelist. I can promise listeners his view is also very different from Paul's and very different from Gadi's, and all of them different from each other, but all of them and more, the very best people that I could think of and that we at Telos could think of, and more to come to address these questions. So more to look forward to, and plenty here in this extended interview. We've gone over time with Paul Gross Sr., fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem, speaking on his own behalf here today as a citizen of the Jewish state. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks so much, Gabby, and thanks to Telos for this great initiative.